Seeing me holding my newborn in worn-out clothes, my sister frowned. "Look at you. Was not $250,000 a month from our father's trust fund enough for you to buy a decent shirt for my nephew?" she asked sharply, her voice cutting through the chatter of the crowded room. I met her eyes and said quietly, "I never received a single dollar." For a moment, the entire room went completely silent. Then she grabbed her phone and frantically called her trust lawyers. Minutes later, her face drained of all color when she heard the exact zero balance. But the truth of where that massive fortune had actually gone was much worse. "My name is Maya, and I am 34 years old. If you are watching this from somewhere where family drama hits close to home, take a moment to like and subscribe. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled the ultimate betrayal from my own blood." It was late Thursday afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. The weather outside in our affluent Atlanta suburb was crisp and cool, but inside my sister Chloe's sprawling $12 million penthouse mansion, the air felt suffocatingly thick. I stood in the grand foyer holding my 3-month-old son Leo tightly against my chest. He was wrapped in a faded cotton baby blanket that had seen better days. I was wearing a pair of thrift store jeans and a frayed wool sweater that hung loosely over my postpartum frame. The contrast between my appearance and the sheer opulence of my surroundings was glaring. The penthouse smelled of expensive catered roasted turkey warm cinnamon apple tarts and heavy designer perfumes. Through the massive glass French doors, I could see the main living room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported Italian leather sofas and the towering floral centerpieces. Around the custom mahogany dining table sat the people who were supposed to be my family. They were laughing and clinking crystal champagne flutes, completely oblivious to my arrival. My mother Brenda was seated at the head of the table sipping a glass of rare vintage red wine. She was draped in expensive silk and wearing the heavy diamond necklace she insisted she deserved for raising us. Across from her, my brother Trey was loudly bragging to a distant cousin about his latest luxury sports car purchase. And then there was my older sister Chloe. At 38 years old, Chloe was the highly visible chief executive officer of a massive cosmetics empire. She looked every bit the part of a wealthy socialite. She wore a custom-tailored emerald green dress that clung perfectly to her figure, and her hair was styled into flawless glossy waves. I took a deep breath, adjusting Leo in my arms, and stepped off the marble floor of the foyer onto the plush white rug of the living room. As soon as I crossed that threshold, the loud, joyous laughter in the room abruptly died. Forks clattered against fine bone china plates. The soft jazz music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly seemed incredibly loud. Every single pair of eyes turned toward me. The disgust on their faces was not hidden or subtle. It was paraded openly. Chloe set her crystal champagne flute down on the table with a sharp clink that echoed in the sudden quiet. She pushed her chair back and stood up. She marched toward me, her designer heels clicking rhythmically and menacingly on the hardwood floor, until she stopped just inches away from me. She did not look down at my sleeping son. She did not ask how I was doing after giving birth. She did not offer me a seat. Instead, her perfectly lined eyes raked up and down my cheap clothes with absolute contempt. She crossed her arms over her chest and let out a harsh, cruel scoff. "Look at you, Maya. Just look at you. You walk into my home on a holiday looking like you just crawled out of a homeless shelter. Was not $250,000 a month from our father's trust fund enough for you to buy a decent shirt for my nephew?" She spat the words out like venom, making sure her voice was loud enough for every single guest in the massive room to hear. The relatives sitting at the dining table murmured in agreement. My mother Brenda shook her head in visible dramatic disappointment, letting out a loud sigh. They all thought I was a pathetic failure. They all believed the narrative that I was squandering a massive inheritance on some reckless, irresponsible lifestyle. I felt the comforting weight of my son in my arms. He was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the toxic hostility radiating from the woman standing right in front of us. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not show an ounce of the weakness they were all desperately hoping to see. I looked straight into my sister's eyes. My voice was completely steady, calm, and chillingly even when I delivered the words that would begin to shatter her perfect reality. "I never received a single dollar," I said quietly. Chloe froze. Her mocking, arrogant smile faltered just for a fraction of a second before she quickly masked it with intense irritation. She let out a loud, dramatic groan and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "Stop lying, Maya. We all know the trust distribution started the moment Dad passed away 6 months ago. Bradley handled the estate paperwork himself. Do not stand in my $12 million house and play the helpless victim when you are getting $250,000 every single month. You are pathetic." I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I took one single step closer to her, forcing her to look directly at my unwavering, calm expression. "Call the lawyers," I challenged softly. "Call the wealth management firm right now, Chloe. Put them on speakerphone. Prove me wrong in front of all your esteemed guests." Chloe glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. "Fine," she snapped aggressively. "If you really want to humiliate yourself in front of the entire family, I will gladly oblige." She reached into her expensive designer handbag resting on the console table and pulled out her phone. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped the screen with violent force as she dialed the direct number for the senior partner at the law firm managing our late father's enormous estate. The room was so incredibly quiet, you could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of my newborn son. Everyone watched in eager anticipation, waiting for me to be publicly exposed as a greedy, ungrateful liar. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "This is Richard Sterling. How can I help you on a holiday, Chloe?" Chloe smiled triumphantly, shooting me a look of pure venom. She pressed the speaker button and held the phone up high for the entire dining room to hear clearly. "Richard, I am so sorry to bother you today, but I need you to confirm something for my delusional sister. Can you please state the current balance of Maya's trust account and verify that the $250,000 monthly transfers have been successfully routed to her personal checking account?" There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched so tightly, it felt like a physical, suffocating weight pressing down on the entire room. When Richard finally spoke, his tone was entirely professional, but laced with clear, absolute confusion. "Chloe, I am not exactly sure what you mean," he said slowly. "The trust account was entirely liquidated. All assets were transferred out completely. The current balance of Maya's trust account is exactly $0.00. Furthermore, no monthly transfers have ever been made to any personal account under Maya's name." The blood instantly drained from Chloe's face. Her triumphant, arrogant smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her hands began to shake. She gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "What do you mean, zero?" she demanded, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "Richard, that is a $50 million trust fund. Where did the money go? Where is the money?" Richard's voice crackled clearly through the phone speaker. "As per the legal authorization documents submitted to our office 5 months ago, the entire sum of the funds was rerouted to an external corporate holding account. I assumed you were fully aware of this transaction since your husband Bradley was the one who personally submitted the signed authorization forms." Chloe dropped her phone. The expensive device hit the solid hardwood floor with a loud, sharp crack, but she did not even look down to see the damage. Her wide, terrified eyes darted wildly around the silent room. The reality of the catastrophic situation was crashing down on her all at once. $50 million was gone. The family's massive safety net was completely gone. But instead of turning her anger toward the truth, she turned her blind panic right back to me. Her shock quickly morphed into violent, irrational rage. She took a threatening, aggressive step toward me, her hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "What did you do?" She screamed, spit flying from her trembling lips. "Where did you hide the money, you thief?" She lunged forward, her manicured hands reaching aggressively for the collar of my worn-out sweater, ready to attack me right there in front of everyone. I held my baby tight to my chest and prepared to step back to protect him. But before her hands could even touch my clothes, a large, heavy hand grabbed her wrist forcefully from behind, stopping her dead in her tracks. The large hand belonged to Bradley. My brother-in-law was a tall, broad-shouldered white man who carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than the average car. His grip on Chloe was firm but controlled. He pulled her back gently but decisively, stepping between us like a valiant knight protecting his fragile wife from a dangerous intruder. Chloe immediately melted into his side, burying her face in his chest and letting out a dramatic sob. The room let out a collective breath of relief. Bradley was the chief financial officer of the family trust and the undisputed golden boy of my mother's eye. To them, he was the voice of reason, the educated outsider who had graciously stooped down to manage our chaotic family affairs. Bradley smoothed his designer tie and looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe disappointment. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper like Chloe did. That was not his style. Bradley preferred a much more insidious form of control. He was a master gaslighter who could stab you in the back and convince you that you fell on the knife yourself. He patted Chloe on the shoulder and walked slowly over to the entryway console table where his imported leather briefcase was resting. The metallic click of the briefcase latches opening sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of crisp white papers. He walked back to the dining table and tossed the documents down with a heavy thud. They were bank statements. Pages and pages of transaction records bearing the official logo of the wealth management firm. They looked incredibly real. But I knew exactly what they were because I analyzed fraudulent documents for a living. They were masterfully forged. Bradley rested his hands on the table and leaned forward, looking around the room to ensure he had a captive audience. He was putting on a clinic in manipulation. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair, acting like a man who was utterly exhausted by the burden of caring for a broken family member. "I am so sorry everyone has to witness this on a holiday," he announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute martyrdom. "We really tried to keep this private to protect Maya's dignity. But since she wants to come in here and play the victim, I have no choice but to show you all the truth." He tapped a manicured finger against the stack of fake statements. "Every single transfer is documented right here. $250,000 routed perfectly on the first of every month directly into Maya's private checking account. I personally authorized every single transaction." Then he turned his piercing gaze directly onto me. He shook his head slowly, a look of deep sorrow etched onto his face. "Come on, Maya. We thought you kicked the gambling habit. We transferred the money religiously. Why are you making up lies to extort your own sister?" The audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was publicly weaponizing a completely fabricated past against me. Years ago, when I was a naive college student, my older brother Trey had stolen a massive amount of money from our father's business. To save himself, Trey blamed it on me, claiming I had a secret underground gambling addiction. My parents had believed Trey without a single moment of hesitation. They never asked for proof. They simply branded me the black sheep and cut me off. Bradley had taken that old painful family rumor and weaponized it to cover his own massive corporate theft. If there was a camera in the room, it would have smoothly panned from my completely stoic, unblinking face directly over to Bradley. His face was a mask of gentle concern for the family, but his eyes gave him away. Deep in his pale blue eyes, he wore a condescending, triumphant smirk. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought because he was a wealthy white executive standing in a room full of people who already despised me, his word would be taken as absolute gospel. The reaction in the room was immediate and entirely predictable. The subtle murmurs of the extended family grew into loud gasps of outrage. Cousins and aunts shook their heads, muttering under their breath about how shameful it was for me to stoop this low. I watched the fake sympathy roll off Bradley in waves. He was enjoying this. He loved playing the intelligent savior who had to step in and manage the chaotic, reckless black sheep of the family. He genuinely believed that I was just a desperate, poor, single mother who would crumble under the weight of his forged paperwork. He thought I would break down crying, admit defeat, and beg for a handout just to survive the winter. He expected me to be intimidated by his title, his suit, and his sheer audacity. Bradley took another step toward me, his hands tucked casually into his trouser pockets. "You know, Maya, I really went to bat for you," he continued, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "When your father passed away, Chloe wanted to cut you out completely. She said you would just blow it all at the casinos like you did back in college, but I convinced her to set up the monthly distributions. I told her we had a moral obligation to help you get back on your feet, especially since you had a baby on the way with no husband in sight. And this is how you repay us, by storming into our home dressed like a vagrant, accusing us of stealing your inheritance." I looked down at the forged documents resting on the mahogany table. Bradley had gone to great lengths to make them look authentic. He had copied the watermarks, the specific font types, and the exact layout used by Richard Sterling's firm. To an untrained eye, they were flawless evidence of my guilt. To the family sitting around the table, they were absolute proof that I was a lying, manipulative addict, trying to steal from the only people who had ever shown me mercy. Chloe had stopped crying and was now looking at me with intense, self-righteous anger. She felt completely vindicated by her husband's brilliant lie. She wiped a stray tear from her perfectly powdered cheek and sneered. "See?" She spat out, her voice sharp and nasal. "You heard him. The money was sent. You probably wired it all to some offshore betting site and lost it in a week. Do not you dare stand there and try to ruin my Thanksgiving with your pathetic lies." I held Leo closer to my chest, feeling his steady heartbeat against mine. The room felt like a tribunal, and Bradley was the self-appointed judge and jury. He stood there basking in the glow of his own deception. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders pulled back, exuding total dominance. He had expertly shifted the entire narrative in less than 3 minutes. I was no longer the victim of a drained trust fund. I was the aggressive, unstable addict harassing her successful sister. This was exactly how Bradley operated. It was how he had managed to seize control of Chloe's entire cosmetics empire piece by piece over the last 5 years. He isolated her, made her depend on him for every financial decision, and painted anyone who questioned him as crazy or jealous. I did not say a word. I simply stared at him, analyzing his micro-expressions. I could see the slight twitch in his jaw, the subtle tension in his neck. Despite his confident performance, he was terrified. He knew the money was gone, and he knew Richard Sterling had just confirmed it on speakerphone. These fake bank statements were a desperate improvisation, a smokescreen designed to confuse Chloe and the rest of the family just long enough for him to figure out a permanent cover-up. He was banking on my silence. He was banking on the historical dynamic of my family, where my voice was always drowned out by their collective judgment. Bradley tilted his head, leaning in closer to me, so only I could see the malicious glint in his eyes. "Do yourself a favor, Maya," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register. "Walk out that door right now. Take your kid, go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and we will pretend this little extortion attempt never happened. Push this any further, and I will have my legal team bury you so deep in litigation you will not even be able to afford diapers." The entire room waited for my response. They waited for me to lower my head in shame and walk out the front door in total defeat. They wanted the deep satisfaction of watching me break in front of them. But I remained perfectly still. My face was a mask of cold, calculated indifference. I was not the scared 20-year-old girl they had bullied in the past. I was not the helpless victim Bradley thought he was manipulating. I let the silence stretch out, letting his empty threats hang in the air like foul smoke. I was giving him enough rope to hang himself. And just as I prepared to speak, the next wave of betrayal came crashing in from the one person who should have protected me from the very beginning. The heavy wooden doors of the gourmet kitchen burst open with a violent thud. My mother Brenda stormed into the dining room, her heels striking the hardwood floor like a judge striking a gavel. From where I stood, she seemed to tower over me, her presence suffocating and absolute. She wore a deep burgundy silk dress that flowed elegantly around her, and the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. In her right hand, she gripped a large glass of expensive vintage red wine. She had not been in the room to hear the phone call with the trust lawyer. She had not heard Richard Sterling confirm that my account was entirely empty. She had only heard the loud, authoritative voice of her wealthy white son-in-law declaring my guilt, and that was all the evidence she would ever need. Without asking a single question about what was happening, she marched directly toward me, her face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. She did not look at my newborn son sleeping against my chest. She did not ask why I was standing there looking so impoverished. She stopped less than a foot away from me, her chest heaving with indignation. For a fleeting second, I thought she might actually strike me. Instead, with a swift and vicious flick of her wrist, she threw the entire contents of her wineglass directly at me. The dark red liquid splashed violently against my frayed wool sweater, seeping instantly into the cheap fabric and splattering across my neck and my cheek. I twisted my body at the very last second, just enough to shield my baby from the impact, taking the brunt of the cold, sticky assault entirely on my own shoulders. The room gasped in unison. The smell of fermented grapes and harsh alcohol immediately masked the scent of the roasted turkey and cinnamon apples. Drops of dark red wine dripped slowly from my chin, down onto the collar of my worn-out shirt, looking remarkably like fresh blood. "Look at what you are doing to this family!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. "You are a complete disgrace, Maya. You have always been a dark stain on this family, and I will not stand here and let you ruin Chloe's beautiful Thanksgiving dinner." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger aggressively in my face. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate kind of rage. She was terrifying in her blind loyalty to the illusion of our family's perfection. She turned her head slightly to look at Bradley, who was standing just a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with a look of deep satisfaction. He did not move to stop her. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, letting my mother do his dirty work. "Bradley is the only reason you even have a roof over your head," Brenda continued, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "He is the only decent man keeping this family afloat. He works tirelessly to manage your late father's estate, to make sure that everyone is taken care of. And this is how you repay him, by storming in here and accusing him of theft. You are delusional, Maya. You are sick." She took another step closer, her breath hot and smelling of wine. "I knew you were a lost cause the day you dropped out of Spelman College. We gave you every opportunity to succeed. We gave you the best education, the best clothes, the best life. And you threw it all away because you lacked discipline. You threw your life away on gambling and bad decisions. Now you stand here dressed like a beggar, trying to extort the very man who convinced your sister not to cut you out completely. You should be on your knees thanking Bradley for his grace. I demand that you apologize to him right now. Apologize to Bradley and then get out of my sight." The silence that followed her outburst was heavy and oppressive. The entire extended family watched with bated breath, waiting for me to shatter. This was the dynamic I had grown up with. My mother had always worshipped at the altar of wealth and status. When Chloe married Bradley, Brenda viewed him as the ultimate prize. He was a wealthy, educated white executive who brought corporate legitimacy to our family name. In my mother's eyes, Bradley could do absolutely no wrong. He was the golden savior, and any attack on him was an attack on her own fragile social standing. She was willing to completely destroy her own daughter just to protect the ego of her son-in-law. I felt the cold wine soaking through my sweater, chilling my skin. I felt the collective judgment of every aunt, uncle, and cousin sitting at that massive dining table. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in self-defense. I did not try to explain about the phone call or the drained trust fund. Explaining would mean I was on the defensive, and I was entirely done defending myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Instead, my right hand dropped slowly to my side. Down by my hip, completely out of my mother's direct line of sight, my fingers curled inward. I formed a fist so incredibly tight that my fingernails bit sharply into the palm of my hand, and my knuckles turned entirely white. It was the only physical manifestation of the intense raging storm inside of me. I channeled every ounce of my childhood pain, every memory of being cast aside, and every single drop of this current humiliation directly into that clenched fist. I grounded myself in the physical sensation of my nails pressing into my skin. It kept me anchored. It kept my face completely devoid of emotion. Moving with deliberate and agonizing slowness, I reached into the side pocket of the cheap canvas diaper bag hanging off my shoulder. I pulled out a generic, unscented baby wipe. The sound of the plastic crinkling was strangely loud in the silent room. I unfolded the thin white cloth and brought it up to my face. I did not look at my mother. I completely ignored her existence. Instead, I locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. I methodically wiped the sticky red wine from my cheek. I wiped it from my chin. I wiped the droplets from my neck. My movements were calm, precise, and chillingly steady. I held Bradley's gaze the entire time. I wanted him to see that his puppet master routine was failing. I wanted him to look into my eyes and realize that the scared little girl he thought he could manipulate no longer existed. Bradley's condescending smile began to falter. The smug satisfaction slowly drained from his face, replaced by a subtle flicker of genuine uncertainty. He shifted his weight uncomfortably under my unwavering stare. He had expected my mother's brutal verbal assault to break me. He had expected me to dissolve into a puddle of tears and run out the front door in total humiliation. But my complete lack of reaction was deeply unsettling to him. It was a terrifying kind of calm. It was the calm of a predator who has already locked the cage doors from the inside. My mother, realizing that I was completely ignoring her, grew even more enraged. "Are you listening to me, you disrespectful brat?" she hissed, stepping directly into my line of sight to block my view of Bradley. I said apologize to him. I lowered the stained baby wipe and finally looked at her. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with the desperate need to control me. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who had just publicly humiliated me to protect a man who was actively robbing her blind. I felt a profound sense of pity for her. She was so blinded by her own toxic favoritism and her desperate need for high society validation that she could not see the massive financial guillotine hanging right above her head. "I am not going to apologize to anyone, Mother," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a sharp metallic edge that cut right through her hysteria. "And I am certainly not going to apologize to a man who is standing in a house he does not truly own, pretending to be a savior." Brenda gasped loudly, clutching her diamond necklace as if I had just physically struck her. The extended family let out a collective murmur of shock. Chloe stepped out from behind Bradley, her face red with anger, ready to launch another verbal attack. But I was not looking at them anymore. I tossed the wine-soaked baby wipe onto the pristine white rug at my mother's feet. I adjusted my grip on my sleeping son, making sure he was safe and secure. I was not retreating. I was simply clearing the battlefield. My mother had played her part perfectly. She had firmly positioned herself on the wrong side of the impending war. She had chosen her allegiance, and now there was absolutely nothing left holding me back from unleashing the absolute truth. I stood tall in the center of the room, letting the wine dry cold against my skin. The tension in the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. I kept my eyes locked on Bradley, watching his chest rise and fall as his breathing grew slightly more rapid. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the next arrogant piece of prey to walk right into the room and seal their own destruction. The tense silence in the living room was violently shattered by the deafening roar of a high-performance engine. The aggressive mechanical growl echoed off the manicured courtyard outside, vibrating straight through the thick floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Everyone turned their heads toward the sound. The heavy, custom mahogany front doors swung open with a dramatic flourish, and my older brother Trey strolled into the foyer. He walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who firmly believed he was the absolute center of the universe. Trey was 36 years old, but he still carried himself like an arrogant fraternity brother who had just hit a massive lottery jackpot. He was dressed head to toe in absurdly flashy designer clothing that screamed new money. He wore a brightly patterned silk shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing a thick gold chain. His tailored white trousers were paired with exotic leather loafers that probably cost more than a reliable used car. He tossed a set of keys bearing a Lamborghini logo onto the entryway console table with a loud metallic clatter, making absolutely sure everyone in the room noticed exactly what he was driving. "What is going on in here?" Trey shouted, his booming voice completely oblivious to the suffocating tension in the room. He did not notice the terrified pale look on Chloe's face. He did not seem to care about the dark red wine stain currently drying on my cheap wool sweater. He was far too absorbed in his own grand entrance. "I just locked down the biggest deal of my entire life, and you all look like somebody died. We are supposed to be celebrating." He swaggered into the dining room, spreading his arms wide, as if waiting for a round of applause. If a camera were filming this moment, it would have glided smoothly alongside his arrogant strut, capturing the awe and admiration of the extended family, before tracking his movement right up to the dining table. He immediately launched into a loud, aggressive monologue about his latest business venture. For the past decade, Trey had bounced from one failed idea to another, always funded by our parents. This time, he claimed to be the founder of a revolutionary tech startup that was going to disrupt the entire software industry. None of us actually knew what the company did, and Trey could never explain the core business model without using vague corporate buzzwords. But that never stopped our family from treating him like a visionary genius. "I just secured a massive Series A funding round," Trey boasted, puffing out his chest and looking around the room to soak in the attention. "The investors are practically begging to throw money at me. I am telling you all right now, this company is going public by next year, and I am going to be a billionaire." As he spoke, he gestured wildly with his hands, intentionally flashing the heavy piece of jewelry strapped to his left wrist. It was a massive diamond-encrusted Rolex watch. The precious stones caught the warm light of the crystal chandeliers, throwing fractured beams of rainbow light across the room. He held his wrist up, tapping the face of the watch with a smug grin. "I had to treat myself," he declared proudly. "You do not close a deal this big and walk away empty-handed. Only the absolute best for the chief executive officer." The transformation in my mother was instantaneous and deeply disturbing. The furious, violent woman who had just thrown a glass of wine at my face vanished entirely. In her place stood a doting, obsessed mother, staring at her eldest son with pure, unfiltered adoration. Brenda practically sprinted across the room, pushing past the dining chairs to throw her arms around Trey. She kissed his cheek repeatedly, her face beaming with absolute pride. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant boy." Brenda gushed, her voice dripping with toxic favoritism. "I always knew you were destined for greatness. You are the absolute pride of this family, Trey. The pride of our entire bloodline. Look at what you have accomplished all on your own through hard work and sheer brilliance." She turned around and glared at me, using Trey's fabricated success as a weapon to deepen my humiliation. "Look at your brother, Maya." Brenda spat, her voice returning to that harsh, venomous tone. "Take a good look at what a real success story looks like. While you are standing there in dirty clothes, begging for handouts and trying to ruin your sister's marriage, your brother is building an empire. You should be taking notes instead of making up vicious lies to hurt the people who take care of you." Bradley was quick to join the sickening chorus of praise. He stepped forward, slipping his hands casually into his tailored suit pockets and gave Trey a firm, validating nod. He played the role of the supportive, wealthy brother-in-law perfectly. "Congratulations, Trey," Bradley said, his deep voice projecting absolute authority and fake sincerity. "I reviewed your initial business proposals last month, and I knew right away you had a winning concept. It takes a brilliant mind to secure that kind of capital in today's market. You have earned every single penny. It was a masterful performance." Bradley was validating Trey's delusions of grandeur right in front of the entire family, cementing his own position as the benevolent patriarch who guided the family to success. But I knew the dark, ugly truth hiding beneath their mutual admiration. Bradley was not praising Trey out of familial love or respect. Bradley supported Trey because Trey was the perfect, useful idiot. A desperate, arrogant man, eager to play the role of a wealthy tech founder without ever looking closely at the actual accounting books. Trey finally seemed to notice me standing quietly in the center of the room. He looked me up and down, his lip curling in a deep sneer of absolute disgust. He completely ignored the sleeping baby resting against my chest. "What is she even doing here?" Trey asked, addressing our mother as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into the house. "I thought we agreed not to invite her this year. And what is that horrible smell? Did she spill cheap wine all over herself? She came here to extort us." "Trey?" Chloe suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking as she desperately tried to regain control of the narrative and hide her own rising panic. "She is claiming that her trust fund is completely empty, and she is trying to blame Bradley for it. It is absolutely pathetic." Trey let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, throwing his head back in pure amusement. "Extort us," he repeated, mocking the very idea. "Are you kidding me, Maya? You are seriously trying to shake down the man who literally pays your rent. You have always been a jealous, bitter loser, but this is a new low even for you. Get out of here before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." The extended family murmured their agreement, nodding along with Trey's harsh, degrading words. The aunts and uncles who had watched me grow up now looked at me with open hostility, fully siding with the wealthy tech founder and the white corporate executive. They were all completely blinded by the flashy cars, the expensive suits, and the diamond watches. They could not see the massive financial house of cards teetering right in front of them, but I could see it. I could see every single fragile supporting beam, and I knew exactly which one to kick to bring the entire structure crashing down. I did not react to Trey's insults. I did not flinch when my mother praised him and degraded me in the exact same breath. My eyes were completely fixed on the heavy, glittering watch strapped to my brother's wrist. The visual focus of my attention zoomed in entirely on that single piece of jewelry, shutting out the noise of their insults and their arrogant laughter. As a financial crimes analyst, my brain does not process diamonds and gold the way normal people do. I do not see luxury. I see ledger entries, wire transfers, and dates of purchase. I analyze the watch with the cold, absolute precision of a predator, zeroing in on a fatal wound. It was not just any Rolex. It was a highly specific model. I knew the exact market value of that piece. I knew the waiting list required to purchase it. And most importantly, my mind instantly cross-referenced the cost of that watch with the specific financial anomalies I had been tracking for the past 6 months. The math was absolutely flawless. The timeline was sheer perfection. Trey thought he was flaunting the ultimate symbol of his hard-earned success. He had absolutely no idea that he had just walked into a room full of people and proudly strapped the murder weapon directly to his own wrist. He had brought me the exact piece of undeniable physical evidence I needed to completely destroy Bradley's carefully constructed lie. A slow, chilling half-smile crept onto my face. It was not a smile of joy or amusement. It was the dark, terrifying smile of a woman who had finally cornered her abusers. I looked up from the diamond-encrusted watch and met Trey's arrogant gaze directly. The trap had not just been sprung. The prey had gleefully locked the cage from the inside. "That is a beautiful piece of machinery, Trey," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the thick, heavy air of the dining room. A Rolex Daytona customized with factory-set diamonds. It is an impressive status symbol for a man claiming to be a self-made tech founder. The entire room fell completely silent. Trey blinked, his arrogant smile faltering just for a second as he looked down at his wrist and then back up at me. He was confused by my sudden shift in tone. He expected me to be crying or screaming, not calmly appraising his jewelry. It retails for exactly $150,000. I continued, stepping away from the entryway and moving slowly toward the massive mahogany dining table. And the waitlist for that specific model is over 2 years unless you buy it on the gray market for a significant premium, which means you paid entirely in cash to secure it immediately. Trey puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant posture. Yeah, I paid cash. He scoffed loudly. Because I am successful, Maya. Because I know how to close deals. Something you clearly know nothing about, looking the way you do right now. I did not look at Trey. I turned my head slowly and locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. My white brother-in-law was still standing there with his hands in his pockets, but his entire body had gone completely rigid. You purchased it on the 12th of last month, Trey. I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The exact same day the first massive withdrawal of $250,000 was made from my private trust fund. Is not that right, Bradley? The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that only happens right before a massive explosion. I watched the color rapidly drain from Bradley's face. His perfectly tanned skin turned an unhealthy shade of pale gray. The smug, condescending smirk that he had worn just moments ago completely vanished. He froze, entirely unable to form a single coherent word. He knew that I had just connected the dots in a way he never anticipated. He thought he had buried the paper trail so deeply in corporate shell companies that a supposedly broke single mother would never be able to trace it. Bradley swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another manipulative lie, but before he could even utter a single syllable, my mother Brenda erupted. She slammed her empty wineglass down onto the dining table with such violent force that the delicate crystal stem completely shattered. Everyone jumped, but Brenda did not even notice the broken glass. She pushed herself away from the table, her face twisted in a mask of pure aggressive rage. She placed herself squarely between me and her precious son Trey, physically shielding him from my words. So what if he did use the money? Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with raw, irrational fury. So what if Bradley transferred the funds to your brother? It is family money, Maya. Family money belongs to the family, not to you to squander on whatever pathetic life you are living. I stood there, absorbing the sheer force of her toxic misogyny. It was one thing to know that my mother favored my brother. It was a completely different level of trauma to hear her explicitly justify the theft of millions of dollars simply because of my gender. He is the eldest son. Brenda continued, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. He is the one building a legacy for our bloodline. He is building an empire. It takes massive capital to run a technology firm, and your father would have absolutely wanted Trey to have every single resource available to him. You are just a woman, Maya. What do you even need that kind of wealth for? You have a baby with no husband. You should be looking for a decent man to take care of you, instead of acting like you are entitled to a fortune you did not even earn. The aunts and uncles sitting around the table murmured their quiet agreement. The deep-rooted generational trauma and the sickening patriarchy embedded in my family were laid entirely bare in that single moment. They genuinely believed that Trey, by virtue of simply being born male, was inherently entitled to everything. They believed that my only purpose was to be subservient, to marry well, and to remain quietly in the background. They saw absolutely nothing wrong with a wealthy white man and an arrogant golden child conspiring to rob a black woman of her rightful inheritance. Chloe looked back and forth between Bradley and our mother. Her eyes were wide with rising panic. She was slowly starting to realize that the fake bank statements Bradley had thrown on the table were exactly that. Fake. If Bradley had taken my money to fund Trey's lavish lifestyle, what else was he hiding from her? But Chloe was too cowardly to speak up. She remained completely silent, clutching her designer dress and watching the disaster unfold. Trey, empowered by our mother's vicious defense, puffed his chest out even further. "Yeah, you heard her," he spat, taking a step closer to me. "The money was just sitting there doing nothing. Bradley and I made a strategic executive decision to put it to good use. I am doubling that investment in 6 months. You should be thanking us for managing your assets instead of standing in my sister's house disrespecting us." I looked at Trey with absolute clinical detachment. He was not a tech genius. He was a financially illiterate puppet. Bradley had used Trey's massive ego and my mother's blind favoritism to orchestrate the perfect crime. Bradley stole the money, fed a small portion of it to Trey to keep him quiet and happy, and pocketed the rest. And the best part for Bradley was that if the authorities ever came knocking, Trey's signature would be the one on all the fraudulent corporate documents. I shifted my gaze back to Bradley. He was sweating now. Tiny beads of perspiration were forming along his hairline. He recognized the look in my eyes. It was not the look of a defeated woman. It was the look of an auditor who had just found the smoking gun. A strategic executive decision. I repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of their defense hang in the air. "You forged my legal signature on federal banking documents, Bradley. You committed wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. And you convinced this entire family that it was a noble act of financial management." Bradley finally found his voice. It was shaky and lacked all of the booming authority he had displayed just 10 minutes ago. "Now you listen to me, Maya," he stammered, raising a hand in a desperate attempt to regain control of the room. "You do not understand how complicated these trust structures are. The money was moved into a high-yield holding company to maximize returns for everyone. You are throwing around serious legal terms that you do not even comprehend." "I do not comprehend them," I asked softly, tilting my head. "I am a woman, so I must be confused by big numbers and corporate structures." "Is that right, Bradley? Is that the defense you are going to use when the federal investigators ask you why $50 million vanished into a shell company registered in Delaware under Trey's name but controlled entirely by your private equity firm?" The color completely drained from Trey's face. He snapped his head around to look at Bradley. "Wait, what?" Trey asked, his voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant swagger. "What private equity firm?" "We agreed the company was entirely mine, Bradley." The first major fracture in their unholy alliance had just appeared. Bradley shot Trey a look of pure venom, silently begging him to shut his mouth. But it was too late. I had just introduced the one thing that could destroy their partnership: paranoia. Trey realized he was not the mastermind he thought he was. Chloe realized her husband was a liar. And my mother, for the first time in her life, looked completely lost. I stood my ground, holding my son tightly. The counterattack had been launched, and the enemy ranks were already beginning to collapse from the inside out. They had spent my entire life underestimating me, treating me like a disposable afterthought while elevating the men in the room to godlike status. But standing in that dining room, surrounded by their shattered crystal and exposed lies, I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. Bradley let out a harsh, patronizing laugh, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with a stubborn toddler. He stepped up to the table, tapping his fingers against the stack of forged documents. "You watch too many crime shows, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Wire fraud and grand larceny are serious accusations. Do you even know what those words mean, or did you just hear them on a true crime podcast? Let me educate you, since you never managed to finish your degree and clearly lack the mental capacity to grasp high-level wealth management." He puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He began to rattle off a dense wall of complex financial jargon designed specifically to intimidate me and confuse everyone else in the room. What we executed was a standard fiduciary restructuring of stagnant assets, he announced, projecting his voice so the entire family could hear his supposed brilliance. We utilized a mezzanine financing model to leverage the trust capital through a decentralized offshore holding vehicle. It is a highly sophisticated tax optimization strategy designed to maximize the earnings before interest taxes, depreciation, and amortization for the entire family portfolio. You see, Maya, when you are dealing with $50 million, you do not just let it sit in a low-yield municipal bond. You aggressively maneuver the liquidity to generate exponential compounding growth. But I would not expect a college dropout dressed in rags to understand the complexities of international private equity. He looked around the room, soaking in the bewildered but deeply impressed faces of my mother and the extended family. None of them understood a single word he had just said. But the sheer arrogant confidence of his delivery was more than enough to convince them that he was the smartest man in the room. He was using advanced vocabulary as a weapon, assuming I was entirely disarmed and uneducated. He thought his corporate word salad would force me into confused submission. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish his entire arrogant speech, letting his lies hang heavily in the air. Then I turned my head away from him and looked straight toward the grand mahogany doors of the foyer. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. From the dark shadows of the entryway, a tall, athletic woman stepped forward into the warm, glowing light of the living room. She was dressed in a razor-sharp black tailored suit, her expression completely stoic and strictly professional. She had been standing out of sight by the front door the entire time, waiting silently for my signal. The loud murmurs in the dining room fell completely dead as she approached me. My mother frowned, her eyes darting frantically between me and the imposing stranger. "Who is this?" Brenda demanded, stepping forward defensively. "Who let this strange woman into my daughter's house?" I ignored my mother completely. I gently shifted my sleeping son Leo in my arms and handed him over to the woman in the black suit. She supported his head, expertly cradling him with highly practiced ease. This was Sarah, my elite private nanny, and a former tactical security specialist. She gave me a brief, respectful nod and took 2 steps back, removing Leo from the immediate center of the conflict. He was safe, secure, and completely out of the line of fire. Now there was absolutely nothing left for me to protect. I was completely free to go on the absolute offensive. Bradley frowned, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction as he watched the seamless professional exchange. He opened his mouth to question what was happening, but he never got the chance to speak. I reached down and grabbed the thick hem of the ratty wine-stained wool sweater I had been wearing since I walked through the door. With one swift, decisive motion, I pulled the heavy fabric over my head and tossed it carelessly onto the pristine white rug at my feet. The collective gasp that echoed through the massive dining room was deafening. Underneath that pathetic, oversized sweater, I was not wearing cheap thrift store clothes. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. The cut was absolutely flawless, hugging my frame with a fierce, unapologetic authority. The crisp white silk button-down shirt beneath the blazer was immaculate and pressed to perfection. I rolled my shoulders back instantly, transforming my entire physical presence. The slouching, defeated posture of a struggling single mother vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by the towering, commanding presence of an apex predator in the corporate financial world. If this moment were captured on film, the camera would have whipped around me in a rapid 180-degree arc, capturing the absolute sheer shock on the faces of my family. The atmosphere and the lighting in the room seemed to shift dynamically from shadowy oppression to striking, brilliant clarity. I was no longer the helpless victim they had trapped in their crosshairs. I was the executioner stepping confidently onto the chopping block. Chloe physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the rug as she bumped into the edge of the mahogany table. Her wide eyes roamed over the exquisite, pristine stitching of my suit, recognizing the luxury brand instantly. She knew the elite cosmetics industry, and she knew high fashion. She knew immediately that the tailored suit I was wearing cost more than her entire seasonal wardrobe budget. Trey stared at me, his jaw practically hitting the hardwood floor. The flashy, obnoxious arrogance he had paraded just minutes ago evaporated into thin air. He realized instantly that the woman standing in front of him exuded a level of genuine, terrifying wealth and power that his fake startup money could never possibly buy. But it was Bradley whose reaction was the most deeply satisfying. His pale blue eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. His brain was desperately trying to process the massive visual contradiction standing right in front of him. The uneducated dropout he had just verbally abused was gone. I reached slowly into the inside breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I kept my cold eyes locked directly on Bradley, watching his rapid, shallow breathing increase. I pulled out a heavy, solid black metal business card. It was cold, heavy, and entirely unforgiving. With a sharp flick of my wrist, I tossed the card onto the mahogany dining table. It flew through the air and landed with a loud, authoritative, metallic clink, coming to rest directly on top of the stack of forged bank statements Bradley had proudly presented earlier. "Read it, Bradley," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute chilling authority. "Read the card aloud for the entire family. Tell them exactly who they are dealing with today." Bradley did not move a single muscle. He was completely paralyzed, staring down at the black metal card as if it were a live explosive grenade sitting on the dining table. I said, "Read it." I snapped, my voice cracking through the room like a heavy whip. Trembling slightly, Bradley reached out his pale hand and picked up the heavy metal card. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his tight throat. He looked down at the engraved silver lettering. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a rough whisper, completely stripped of its previous booming, confident authority. "Maya," he started, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Senior financial crimes analyst." He stopped, completely unable to force the rest of the devastating words out of his dry mouth. "Read the firm, Bradley," I pushed, taking a slow, deliberate, and highly intimidating step toward him. "Do not be shy now. You were so incredibly eager to educate me on fiduciary restructuring just a moment ago." "KPMG International," he whispered. The name of one of the largest and most ruthless global audit and advisory firms in the entire world fell from his trembling lips like a definitive death sentence. My mother Brenda stood completely frozen, her hands hovering nervously near her face in absolute shock. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with sudden fear. "What is she talking about, Bradley?" I did not let him answer her. I took total and absolute control of the room. "It means, Mother, that for the past 8 years, while you all thought I was a pathetic failure, I was actually hunting down corporate thieves for a living," I said, never breaking my intense eye contact with Bradley. "It means I investigate massive financial frauds, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement for federal regulatory agencies and Fortune 500 companies." I walked right up to the edge of the table, pointing a manicured finger down at his forged documents. "So when you stand there, Bradley, and try to dazzle me with empty buzzwords like mezzanine financing and offshore optimization, you sound exactly like every other desperate amateur criminal I have personally put behind federal bars." Bradley took a clumsy step back, bumping hard into his terrified wife. He was completely out of his depth, and his panicked eyes showed that he finally knew it. "Let me educate you now, Bradley," I continued, my voice slicing through the silent room with surgical precision. "A decentralized offshore holding vehicle is only invisible if the primary signatory does not leave a digital fingerprint on the initial wire transfer. But you were incredibly arrogant and remarkably sloppy. You used your personal corporate authorization code to bypass the secondary security protocols on my father's trust. You routed $50 million through a shell company in Delaware listed under Trey's social security number. But the IP address for the transaction pinged directly back to your private office server." I paused, letting the devastating reality of my clinical words sink deep into his terrified brain. "That is not tax optimization, Bradley," I said, leaning forward, resting my hands flat on the table. "That is a textbook violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It carries a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence of 20 years. And those bank statements you just printed to show my mother, That is called presenting fabricated financial instruments to conceal a major felony. You just added another 5 years to your impending federal sentence." The entire room was completely paralyzed in horror. The grand living room, which had been a stage for my public humiliation just moments ago, had dynamically transformed into a sterile, hostile interrogation room. The family members who had laughed at me and called me an addict were now staring at me in terrified, silent awe. I had completely stripped away the pathetic facade they had forced upon me for decades. I was not the broken black sheep. I was the apex predator they had unknowingly invited into their home. Chloe grabbed Bradley by the arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging desperately into the fabric of his expensive suit. "Bradley, tell me she is lying," Chloe begged, her voice cracking with hysterical, rising panic. "Tell me you did not steal her money. Tell me you did not commit federal fraud." But Bradley could not speak a single word of defense. The charismatic manipulator was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, sweating, and terrified animal. He looked desperately down at the heavy black metal card resting on the table, realizing that every single lie he had built his entire life around was currently collapsing into dust. And the best part was that I had not even dropped the heaviest piece of evidence yet. I reached back into the side pocket of the cheap canvas diaper bag that I had carried into the penthouse. That worn-out bag did not just hold baby formula and spare clothes. It held the absolute destruction of Bradley and his entire fabricated existence. I reached past the baby wipes and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a tight string tie. I unwound the string slowly, deliberately, letting the agonizing anticipation fill the dead silent room. I pulled out a massive stack of crisp, thick documents and slammed them down directly onto the polished mahogany dining table right next to Bradley's fabricated papers. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood echoed like a thunderclap. These were not printed on flimsy, cheap home office paper to look like standard bank statements. These were certified official documents pulled directly from the highest level of federal banking oversight. Stamped clearly across the top right corner of every single page was the bright, raised red seal of the Federal Reserve Bank. The deep crimson ink seemed to glow under the warm light of the crystal chandeliers, radiating absolute, undeniable legal authority. I tapped my manicured index finger directly onto the red seal. "These are the real, unedited transaction logs for our father's trust fund, Bradley," I said, my voice cold and echoing with absolute certainty. "Let us take a very close look at your supposed financial genius." I fanned the heavy pages out across the smooth surface of the table so that my mother, my brother, and my sister could see the stark, undeniable contrast between the two sets of documents. Bradley's fake papers showed neat, simple transfers wrapped in clean little lies. The real federal documents showed a chaotic, desperate maze of wire reroutes, shadow transfers, and offshore dummy accounts. It was the frantic digital footprint of a man who was terrified of being caught, but too greedy to stop stealing. I pointed to a specific line item on the very first page of the certified log. On the first day of every single month, exactly $250,000 was withdrawn from the primary trust account. But it never went into a holding vehicle for me to manage. It went directly into a shadow account registered in the Cayman Islands. An account that Bradley opened using my stolen social security number and a completely forged signature. I slid a specific piece of paper across the table, separating it from the rest of the stack. It was a blown-up, high-resolution copy of the original authorization form that had drained my inheritance. I pushed it directly toward Chloe. "Look at the signature, Chloe," I commanded softly but firmly. "Look at the name signed at the bottom of that federal authorization form." Chloe stepped forward, her entire body trembling violently. She looked down at the document, her wide eyes darting frantically across the columns of numbers, and the stark, undeniable proof of her husband's felony. She recognized the signature immediately. It was supposed to spell out my name, but the handwriting was uniquely and undeniably his. The sharp, aggressive loops, the heavy pressure of the pen cutting into the paper, and the slight leftward slant were completely identical to how Bradley signed his own corporate checks. The reality of what she was looking at crashed into her like a physical blow. The man she slept next to, the man she defended, the man who had convinced her to cut ties with her own sister, had orchestrated a massive federal crime under her own roof. Chloe began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved erratically, and she clutched desperately at the collar of her expensive emerald green dress, gasping loudly for air. Her perfectly styled hair fell forward as she stumbled backward, away from the table, away from the documents, and away from the man she had married. She bumped hard into a dining chair, sending it scraping loudly across the hardwood floor. "He forged it," she gasped, her voice high-pitched and strangled with raw panic. "Oh my God, you forged her name, Bradley. You actually forged her name on federal banking documents. You stole the money, you stole our father's money, and you made it look like she took it." Chloe's knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the back of the dining chair just to keep herself standing. She was completely unraveling right in front of the entire family. The perfect, wealthy socialite facade had been entirely shattered by a single piece of paper. "It gets significantly worse, Chloe," I said, refusing to let the momentum slow down for even a single second. I traced my finger down the page to the secondary transfer log, tracing the exact path of the stolen capital. From that offshore shadow account, the massive sum of money was broken down into smaller, seemingly untraceable increments. Those increments were then funneled directly back into the United States and deposited right into Trey's Delaware Shell Company. I turned my cold gaze toward my brother. Trey was standing completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open as the catastrophic truth washed over him. "That is how your brilliant brother funded his flashy new tech startup," I announced to the silent, horrified room. "He did not secure a massive Series A funding round. He does not have a revolutionary business model, and no outside investors are throwing money at him. He is living entirely off the stolen monthly allowance that was legally willed to my infant son and me. Trey is not a tech founder. He is a glorified money mule for a massive corporate embezzlement scheme orchestrated entirely by your husband." The room began to spin for everyone except me. My mother Brenda looked like she was going to be physically sick. She stared at Trey, her golden child, realizing that his entire empire was built on stolen cash and federal fraud. Trey looked down at his diamond-encrusted Rolex watch, suddenly realizing that he was wearing a piece of highly illegal evidence right on his wrist. Bradley was sweating profusely now. Heavy, thick drops of perspiration rolled down his temples, soaking rapidly into the stiff white collar of his expensive custom shirt. He frantically wiped his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, smearing the sweat across his face. His breathing was ragged and shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, desperate bursts. He looked like a trapped rat desperately searching for a way out of a burning building, but his massive white male ego absolutely refused to let him admit total defeat. He could not accept that a black woman he had deemed uneducated and pathetic had just entirely dismantled his life's work in under 10 minutes. He desperately clung to his manufactured superiority, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of authority he had left in the room. He puffed out his chest and stood up straighter, trying to physically dominate the space, even as his entire world collapsed. He pointed a shaking finger at the certified documents, his hand trembling so violently he could barely keep it straight. "It was a strategic family investment," he stammered, his voice cracking pitifully, betraying his intense terror. "You are taking this entirely out of context, Maya. You are twisting the narrative to make it look like something it is not." He looked around the room, desperately pleading with the silent family members to believe him. The family needed liquid capital to grow the overall portfolio. He continued, his words rushing out in a frantic, panicked blur. "I made an executive decision. I had to bypass the red tape to reinvest the stagnant funds into a high-growth technological sector. I was protecting the family's wealth. I was doing what your father would have wanted me to do. It was a strategic reallocation of assets." I looked at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive. Even with the undeniable proof of federal forgery staring him right in the face, he was still trying to gaslight the entire room into believing he was the hero. He was still trying to use his corporate vocabulary to hide the fact that he was nothing more than a common thief in an expensive suit. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, bringing my face just inches away from his sweating, terrified face. "You do not forge a signature for a strategic family investment, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that carried clearly across the silent room. "You do not route a legal trust fund through the Cayman Islands just to avoid red tape, and you certainly do not lie to your wife and your mother-in-law about where the money went while letting them publicly humiliate the rightful owner of those funds." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His throat was completely dry. His eyes darted wildly around the room looking for anyone to support him. He looked at Trey, but Trey immediately took a step back, desperately trying to distance himself from the sinking ship. He looked at Brenda, but my mother was completely paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror. Finally, he looked at his wife. But Chloe was staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are a thief, Bradley," I stated firmly, delivering the absolute final blow to his pathetic ego. "You are a fraudulent, arrogant thief who thought he could outsmart a financial crimes investigator because you were too blinded by your own supremacist arrogance to ever see me as a threat. And now you are going to lose absolutely everything." The grand dining room, once filled with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses, was now suffocated by a terrifying silence. The reality of Bradley's crimes hung heavy in the air, a physical weight pressing down on everyone. I watched the realization wash over my family members. The aunts and uncles who had mocked me minutes ago were now staring at the certified bank statements with wide, horrified eyes. They were slowly understanding that the golden boy, the savior they had worshipped, was a massive fraud. But my mother, Brenda, refused to accept reality. She had spent her entire life building her identity around the success of the men in her family. To admit that Bradley was a criminal meant admitting that her entire worldview was a lie. She stepped forward, pushing past Chloe, her face twisted into a mask of desperate, irrational anger. She didn't look at the forged documents. She didn't look at the undeniable proof of federal crimes. She only looked at me, and her eyes burned with a terrifying, protective fury. "Maya," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "What are you doing? Are you trying to send your own brother and brother-in-law to prison?" Her words echoed off the high ceilings, a stark declaration of her priorities. She wasn't angry that I had been robbed. She wasn't angry that her trust fund had been looted. She was furious that I dared to expose the thieves. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. The woman who had consistently chosen my brother over me, who had praised his every minimal achievement while dismissing my hard work. I saw the pure, unadulterated, toxic favoritism radiating from her. She was willing to sacrifice my financial security, my future, and the future of my newborn son just to protect the fragile egos of the men she worshipped. "This family took care of you, you ungrateful brat." Brenda continued, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "We gave you everything. We clothed you, we fed you, we paid for your education. And this is how you repay us, by tearing us apart. Burn it. Burn those papers right now. Just consider the money an investment in Trey. He's building something important. He needs that capital." The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was openly asking me to destroy evidence of a federal felony to protect my brother's delusional tech startup. She was asking me to swallow the theft of $50 million because in her eyes Trey's imaginary empire was worth more than my actual life. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid, my expression completely unreadable. The charcoal gray Tom Ford suit felt like armor, a physical representation of the boundaries I was finally setting. I let her hysterical words wash over me, feeling the last remaining threads of our maternal bond snap completely. The desperate little girl inside me who had always craved her approval finally died, replaced by a cold, calculating professional who understood exactly what needed to be done. "I am not burning anything, Mother," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made her flinch. "And I am certainly not investing $50 million in a shell company used to launder money." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest, as if I had physically struck her. "You are a monster!" She hissed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How can you be so cold? He is your brother. Bradley is your family. You are going to destroy Chloe's marriage. You are going to ruin all of our lives." "I am not destroying anything," I replied, my voice perfectly even. "Bradley destroyed his own marriage the moment he forged my signature. Trey destroyed his own life the moment he accepted stolen funds. And you, mother, you destroyed our relationship the moment you decided my worth was determined by my gender." I turned my attention back to Bradley, completely ignoring my mother's continuous hysterical sobbing. Bradley was still sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for a way out. He had thought my mother's outburst would force me to back down. He had relied on the historical dynamic of my family, where Brenda's irrational anger always bullied me into submission. But he hadn't realized that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer playing the role of the obedient, silent daughter. I was the architect of their absolute ruin, and I was going to ensure every single one of them faced the consequences of their actions. I established a wall of steel, showing zero compromise. I had brought the certified bank statements, the proof of his forgery, and the sheer force of my professional expertise. I was going to dismantle their pathetic facade piece by piece, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth was entirely exposed. The time for silent suffering was over. The time for brutal, calculated justice had begun. Bradley stood at the end of the mahogany table, breathing heavily. The sweat that had been pouring down his face suddenly seemed to run cold. He looked at the certified documents, then looked at my mother, who was still weeping softly into her hands. He looked at Trey, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Finally, he looked at me. And in that exact moment, I saw the very last shred of his carefully crafted corporate persona burn away completely. The sophisticated chief financial officer vanished. What was left standing in the dining room was a cornered, deeply arrogant man who was utterly enraged that a black woman had outsmarted him. His hands stopped trembling. He straightened his posture, pulling his broad shoulders back and adjusting his ruined silk tie. A dark, vicious sneer twisted his lips. It was a look of pure, unfiltered contempt. For years he had played the role of the benevolent outsider who had graciously lowered himself to manage our chaotic family affairs. Now, with his back against the wall, his true colors bled through the expensive fabric of his suit. "You think some printed papers scare me, Maya?" he asked, his voice dropping the frantic panic and replacing it with a cold, venomous arrogance. "You think you can walk into this house in your little designer suit and play the role of the big bad federal investigator? Let me remind you exactly who you are dealing with. I hold the legal corporate seals. Every bank account, every property deed, every trust fund requires my signature to even exist." He stepped away from the table, pacing slowly across the plush white rug. He gestured dismissively toward my mother and brother. "Look at them." He sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. "Look at the absolute state of this family. A delusional mother who worships money she did not earn, and an incompetent son who could not run a lemonade stand, let alone a technology startup. Without my white brains running things, you people would be out on the streets picking through garbage." The racial slur was not screamed. It was delivered with a quiet, terrifying casualness that made it infinitely worse. The phrase "you people" hung in the air, dripping with generations of systemic arrogance and deep-seated supremacy. He did not see us as his equals. He had never seen Chloe as his equal. He saw us as his personal property. We were nothing more than a profitable circus, and he believed he was the rightful ringmaster simply because of the color of his skin. My mother Brenda stopped crying instantly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with absolute shock. The man she had defended, the man she had thrown a glass of wine at her own daughter to protect, had just looked her in the eye and reduced her entire existence to garbage. The diamond necklace she wore suddenly looked like a heavy collar. All her desperate attempts to assimilate into elite high society, all her fawning over his whiteness, had meant absolutely nothing. To Bradley, she was just another clueless minority to be exploited and discarded. Trey took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Say that again, Bradley." Trey challenged, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and sudden defensive rage. "Say that again to my face." But Bradley did not even flinch. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "What are you going to do, Trey?" he mocked, stepping right up to my brother and looking down at him. "You are going to fight the man who pays the lease on that ridiculous sports car parked outside. You are a clown, Trey. You are a diversity hire in your own fake company. I built your entire life with the stroke of my pen. You exist because I allow you to exist." Trey froze, the fight completely draining out of him. He was a coward who had always relied on other people's money, and Bradley knew exactly how to paralyze him with that truth. Chloe let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She pushed herself away from the dining chair, her emerald green dress trembling as she took a step toward her husband. "Bradley, how can you say these things?" she whispered, her voice broken and hollow. "I am your wife. We built this life together. My cosmetics company, my brand, everything we have, we built it as partners." "Partners." Bradley repeated the word as if it tasted foul in his mouth. He turned his cold blue eyes toward Chloe, looking at the woman he had married with absolute unvarnished hatred. "We were never partners, Chloe. You were the pretty face on the marketing campaigns. You were the diversity angle that the corporate investors loved to see. But I was the one doing the real work behind the scenes. I was the one structuring the deals, holding the margins together, and making sure your little makeup hobby actually turned a profit. You honestly think a woman like you could manage a global supply chain without me?" Chloe wrapped her arms around her own stomach, looking as though she was going to be physically sick. The psychological abuse she had suffered for years, the constant subtle undermining of her intelligence, was suddenly dragged out into the harsh light of day. She realized that Bradley had never loved her. He had systematically isolated her from anyone who might question his authority, taking complete control of her finances and her self-esteem under the guise of being a supportive husband. I watched his racist, narcissistic meltdown with absolute clinical detachment. He was trying to regain control of the room by utilizing the oldest weapon in his arsenal, which was psychological domination through racial and intellectual superiority. But I was immune to his poison. "You are giving yourself entirely too much credit, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his arrogant rant. "You did not build anything. You operated like a common parasite, latching onto a wealthy family and slowly draining the host. But what fascinated me during my investigation was not the fact that you stole my $50 million trust fund. It was the fact that you were desperate enough to do it in the first place." Bradley stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes narrowing into two dangerous slits. "A man with your supposed financial genius does not commit sloppy federal wire fraud unless he is backed into a severe corner." I continued, taking a step closer to the table and tapping the certified bank statements. "My trust fund was not a strategic investment. It was a desperate bailout. So tell me, Bradley, what kind of massive, catastrophic debt were you trying to cover up?" For a long, terrifying moment, Bradley just stared at me. The muscles in his jaw ticked rhythmically. Then a slow, dark, and entirely unhinged smile spread across his face. He realized that the game was completely over. He was going to prison, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. But if he was going down, he was going to make absolutely sure that the family he despised so deeply went down with him. He was going to scorch the earth on his way out. "You really think you have it all figured out? Do not you, Maya?" he said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. "You think you are the hero walking in here to save the day and reclaim your stolen money, but you are way too late." He walked back over to his leather briefcase. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying calm of a man lighting a match in a room completely filled with gasoline. He reached inside and pulled out a single black folder, throwing it onto the table next to the federal documents. Your $50 million trust fund was just the monthly interest payment, he announced, his words dropping like heavy stones onto the mahogany table. I did not just drain your accounts, Maya. I needed massive collateral to secure an offshore line of credit that went completely sideways. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified whimper. Collateral, she repeated the word, barely escaping her throat. What collateral, Bradley? Bradley turned to his wife, his smile widening into a grotesque display of sheer malice. Your company, Chloe. Your beautiful, diverse, globally recognized cosmetics empire. Did you really think I had you sign those massive stacks of operational documents last year, just for tax purposes? You signed away the complete controlling interest of your own corporation. The room started to spin for Chloe, but Bradley did not stop. He delivered the final, devastating blow with absolute precision. I secretly leveraged your entire cosmetics empire as collateral to take out a $50 million illicit loan from an unregulated private equity syndicate in Eastern Europe, he declared, his voice ringing with twisted triumph. And because my investments failed, we are completely defaulted on that loan. So go ahead, Maya. Call the federal authorities. Send me to prison. Because by Monday morning, those very dangerous men are going to legally seize every single warehouse, every single patent, and every single dollar associated with Chloe's company. You did not just expose me today, Maya. You successfully bankrupted your entire family. The silence following Bradley's declaration was absolute. Then Chloe's legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the plush white rug, the heavy fabric of her emerald green designer dress, pooling around her like shattered glass. She did not brace her fall. She hit the floor hard, her hands clutching her stomach as she gasped for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Her perfect, glossy hair fell across her face in a tangled mess, hiding the tears that immediately began to stream down her perfectly powdered cheeks. My company. Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently the words were barely recognizable. My entire life. You gave it to them. You gave everything to people we do not even know. Bradley looked down at his wife with zero remorse. He adjusted his suit jacket, his posture screaming absolute arrogant victory. I secured capital to keep this family in the lifestyle it demands. Chloe, he said, his voice cold and devoid of any husbandly affection. I took a calculated risk. But your sister here is the one choosing to pull the pin on the grenade. If she makes that phone call, those men will come to collect. They will take your warehouses, your brand name, this $12 million penthouse, and probably the clothes off your back. So who is the real enemy here? Me, or the woman standing there in the expensive suit ready to leave you homeless? It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He had placed the gun in my hand and told his wife that I was the one pulling the trigger. I waited for Chloe to turn her rage toward the man who had actually orchestrated this nightmare. I waited for the fierce, independent chief executive officer to rise up and defend the empire she had spent a decade building. I waited for my sister to finally see the truth, to stand beside me, and to help me send this parasite to federal prison. But she did not. Chloe slowly lifted her head, looking around the massive dining room. She looked at the imported Italian leather sofas, the crystal chandeliers, the lavish catered holiday spread, and the fine bone china. She looked at the physical manifestations of her high society status. And I watched the exact moment her moral compass completely shattered under the terrifying weight of losing her luxurious lifestyle. She could not fathom a life without the country club memberships, the private jets, and the blind envy of her wealthy socialite friends. She would rather live in a dangerous, fabricated lie than face the harsh, impoverished truth. Chloe scrambled across the floor, crawling on her hands and knees until she reached my feet. She grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers, her manicured fingers digging into my legs with desperate, pathetic force. Maya, please, Chloe begged, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. You cannot do this. You cannot call the authorities. You cannot expose him. I looked down at her, genuine shock temporarily breaking through my cold, professional exterior. Chloe, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice tight. He stole $50 million from me. He forged federal banking documents. He secretly mortgaged your entire life to a criminal syndicate. He belongs in a maximum security prison. But if he goes to prison, I lose everything, Chloe screamed, her tears soaking into my pant leg. The syndicate will seize the company. They will take this house. Where will I go, Maya? What will I do? I have a reputation to maintain. I am a public figure. If the press finds out my company is tied to Eastern European criminals, I will be a laughingstock. I will be ruined. You have to let him fix this. You have to stay quiet. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer depth of her cowardice. You want me to walk away from my stolen inheritance so you can pretend to be a successful executive while your husband launders money for dangerous criminals? I summarized the words, tasting like acid in my mouth. Instead of feeling shame, Chloe's desperation rapidly morphed into a vicious, defensive rage. She let go of my legs and pushed herself up to a standing position, swaying slightly on her expensive heels. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a familiar toxic spite. She fell right back into the family dynamic, utilizing the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She began to completely gaslight me. "This is exactly what you wanted, is not it?" Chloe spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You did not come here today to get justice. You came here to destroy me. You have always been jealous of me, Maya. You were jealous of my success, my beauty, my marriage. You wanted to see me lose everything. I did not take your money." "Chloe," I replied softly, my voice devoid of emotion. "Bradley did." "You could have come to me privately," Chloe yelled, completely ignoring my words. Her face was flushed red, the veins in her neck bulging. "If you were a real sister, you would have pulled me aside. We could have handled this quietly. Bradley could have moved some funds around and paid you back over time. But no. You had to come in here dressed in rags, playing the victim, and waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate us all. You set a trap for us. You are vindictive and cruel. You are actively choosing to destroy this family." My mother, Brenda, who had been watching the scene unfold in terrified silence, suddenly found her voice again. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Chloe, glaring at me with absolute murderous intent. "Listen to your sister, Maya," Brenda hissed. "Do not you dare make that phone call. If you tear down Chloe's company and send Bradley to jail, you are no daughter of mine. You will be dead to this family. You will have destroyed our entire legacy because of your selfish greed. My selfish greed." The phrase echoed in my mind, a sickening reflection of their absolute delusion. I was the victim of a massive multi-million-dollar theft, yet in their twisted reality, I was the villain for refusing to be robbed in silence. As Chloe and my mother continued to hurl insults and blame at me, the world around them seemed to slow down. If a camera were capturing this moment, it would execute a very slow, agonizingly deliberate dolly push directly toward my face. The background noise of their shouting, Trey's nervous shuffling, and Bradley's smug breathing would gradually fade out, leaving only the tight, intimate focus on my expression. The lens would capture the profound, world-shattering disappointment in my eyes. It was the final, dying breath of the little girl who had spent her entire life hoping that one day her family would choose her, hoping that one day they would see her worth and stand by her side when she needed them most. I looked at Chloe, really looked at her, and saw a hollow, pathetic shell of a woman. She was a hostage suffering from a terminal case of Stockholm Syndrome, fiercely defending the man who had just proudly announced he owned her entirely. And as the imaginary camera pushed in closer, tighter on my features, that profound disappointment began to physically change. The subtle tension in my brow relaxed. The slight hopeful light in my eyes extinguished completely, replaced by a cold, flat, endless void. The transformation was absolute. The emotional detachment froze over my features like a thick sheet of winter ice. I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. No anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for their approval. The biological ties that bound us together had been permanently severed by their own cowardice and greed. They were no longer my mother, my sister, or my brother. They were simply co-conspirators in a massive federal financial crime. They were targets. And as a senior financial crimes analyst, I did not show mercy to targets who refused to surrender to the truth. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical shouting. I did not try to defend my character or explain my motives. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh, cold light, highlighting the absolute deadness in my expression. I looked past Chloe, past my mother, and locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. His arrogant smile faltered slightly as he saw the phone in my hand. He had expected Chloe's breakdown to manipulate me into submission. He had expected the threat of the Eastern European syndicate to terrify me into silence. He had grossly miscalculated everything about who I was. I unlocked the screen and tapped the icon for my contacts. I was not calling the local police. I was not calling a civil attorney. I was calling the direct encrypted line of the lead federal prosecutor for the Organized Crime Division. I held the phone up, letting my thumb hover directly over the bright green call button, ensuring every single person in the room understood exactly what was about to happen next. Bradley saw my thumb hovering over the bright green call button, and his pure survival instinct finally kicked in. He did not try to negotiate with me. He did not try to plead for mercy. He lunged wildly across the open space between us, his face contorted in absolute desperate panic. But Sarah, my elite security specialist, stepped instantly out of the dark shadows of the foyer, blocking his path with her own body. Bradley hit a solid wall of highly trained muscle and stumbled backward, cursing loudly as he lost his footing on the plush rug. Realizing he could not physically reach me, he dug frantically into his own tailored trouser pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He bypassed dialing the local police entirely. Instead, he hit the red emergency panic button connected directly to the private security firm that heavily patrolled the ultra-exclusive gated community. Because Chloe and Bradley paid tens of thousands of dollars a month for premium armed protection, the response time was incredibly fast. Within 90 seconds, the heavy custom mahogany front doors burst open with a violent crash. 3 massive security guards stormed directly into the penthouse living room. They were huge, imposing white men wearing dark tactical vests and heavy utility belts. Their hands rested aggressively on their holstered weapons as they scanned the room for an immediate physical threat. The sudden influx of brute force immediately changed the entire atmospheric dynamic of the dining room. If a camera were filming the scene, it would have switched to a slight handheld shake. The frame would feel intentionally unstable and deeply claustrophobic, inducing a sudden spike of severe anxiety as the large men quickly closed the distance and completely surrounded me. Bradley immediately pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at me. "Get her out of my house right now!" He bellowed, his voice echoing with desperate manufactured authority. "She is an unhinged trespasser. She broke in here threatening my wife and violently harassing my family. I want her physically removed from this property immediately." The lead security guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick neck and cold, assessing eyes, stepped aggressively toward me. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not evaluate the situation objectively. He simply looked at my dark skin and my defiant posture, then looked over at the wealthy white homeowner in the expensive suit and immediately made his biased decision. "Ma'am, you need to step back and put the phone down." The guard ordered, his voice incredibly deep and menacing. He unclipped the strap on his holster, making a deliberate clicking sound meant to severely intimidate me. Bradley stepped out from behind the wall of armed guards, his arrogant confidence rapidly reinflating now that he had absolute physical backup. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Maya," he sneered aggressively, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You think you can just march into my home and threaten me with an encrypted phone call? What you just did is a massive federal crime. You illegally hacked into a highly secure offshore banking server to steal those financial documents. That is federal cyber intrusion. You committed corporate espionage to extort my family." He took a step closer, safely shielded by the 3 massive guards. "My legal team will bury you so deep in federal litigation you will never see the light of day again." Bradley threatened, his voice dripping with venomous malice. "I will personally make sure you lose your corporate job, your professional license, and your child. You are going to rot in a federal cell for hacking my private servers." While I was completely boxed in by the three large guards, Bradley saw his ultimate opportunity to destroy the truth. He darted toward the mahogany dining table and snatched the thick manila envelope and the certified banking documents right off the polished wood. He clutched the heavy stack of papers tightly to his chest, as if his entire pathetic life depended on it. He let out a breathless, manic laugh of pure triumph. The physical evidence, the only thing tying him to the massive $50 million theft, was suddenly back in his complete possession. I stood perfectly still, letting the guards aggressively crowd my personal space. I did not fight them. I did not raise my voice or tell them to back off. I simply watched Bradley self-destruct in real time. Bradley turned his back on me and marched directly toward the massive custom stone fireplace dominating the far wall of the living room. The gas flames were roaring high, casting flickering orange shadows across his flushed face. He stood right at the edge of the hearth, holding the thick stack of certified documents out over the open, raging fire. "You have absolutely nothing now, Maya," he declared, his voice ringing with twisted, arrogant victory. "These papers were your only leverage. Without them, you are just a bitter, delusional woman, making wild, baseless accusations against a highly respected corporate financial executive. Let us see how your federal prosecutor likes a criminal case with zero physical proof." The shift in the room was immediate and entirely sickening. My family, who just moments ago had been utterly terrified by the glaring truth, suddenly saw Bradley regaining total control, and like the moral cowards they were, they immediately scurried right back under his protective shadow. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound relief. She wiped the dark mascara tears from her ruined makeup and pushed herself up off the floor, standing tall once again. She smoothed down the fabric of her emerald green designer dress and looked at me with a harsh, triumphant sneer. Her fear was completely gone, replaced by the toxic elitism she used to shield her own massive insecurities. "You really thought you could come in here and destroy us?" Chloe mocked, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "You are so incredibly pathetic, Maya. You played your little revenge game and you completely lost. Now you are going to jail." Trey let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, completely forgetting the fact that he was heavily implicated in a federal money laundering scheme. He adjusted the diamond-encrusted Rolex on his wrist and took a bold, swaggering step toward the security guards. "Make sure you throw her out the back service elevator," he instructed the armed men, waving his hand dismissively. "We do not want the wealthy neighbors seeing this kind of absolute trash walking through the main residential lobby. She smells like cheap wine anyway." My mother, Brenda, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, shaking her head in deep theatrical disappointment. "I told you to leave, Maya," Brenda said, her tone filled with cold, absolute finality. "You brought this entirely on yourself. You tried to maliciously ruin your brother and your sister because of your own selfish, deep-seated jealousy. You could not stand to see them succeed while you lived a miserable, lonely life. Now look at you. You are being thrown out of a $12 million penthouse like a common street criminal. You are completely dead to this family. Do not ever contact us again." The guards moved in closer, invading my personal space, until I could smell the strong scent of their heavily starched uniforms. The lead guard reached out and grabbed my upper arm, his large, heavy hand clamping down hard on the fine fabric of my tailored charcoal suit. "Let us go right now, lady," he ordered, giving me a rough, forceful pull toward the grand foyer. "If you resist, I will put you in handcuffs and drag you out to the pavement." Bradley stood triumphantly by the fireplace, lowering the stack of documents closer to the roaring flames. The intense heat caused the edges of the thick federal paper to curl and brown slightly. He looked over his shoulder at me, his pale blue eyes shining with absolute malicious joy. He firmly believed he had won. He believed that his whiteness, his wealth, and his sheer audacity had successfully insulated him from any real-world consequences. He thought the heavy walls of his gated community could keep the federal government at bay. "Say goodbye to your massive inheritance, Maya," he whispered loudly enough for the entire silent room to hear. "Say goodbye to your fancy corporate career. You are absolutely nothing. You have always been nothing. And tomorrow morning, I am going to call the police and file a formal cyber-terrorism report against you." I felt the heavy bruising grip of the security guard on my arm. I heard the cruel, mocking laughter of my brother and the cold, dismissive sighs of my mother and sister. I watched the man who had stolen my future holding the absolute proof of his crimes over an open fire. Any normal person would have panicked. Any normal person would have screamed or cried or begged the guards to listen to reason. But I was not a normal person. I was a senior financial crimes analyst who had spent 8 years building airtight legal cases against men exactly like Bradley. Men who were so deeply blinded by their own supreme arrogance that they could not see the massive steel trap closing directly over their heads. I did not pull my arm away from the guard. I simply turned my head and looked directly at Bradley. I let a slow, chilling, and entirely confident smile spread across my face. It was a smile that completely unsettled the room, causing Trey's laughter to die in his throat and Chloe's smug sneer to falter. "Burn them, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly over the sound of the roaring fireplace. "Go ahead and drop them right into the fire. Do you honestly believe a federal investigator brings the sole original copy of a $50 million wire fraud indictment to a family holiday dinner?" Bradley froze, his hand hovering just inches above the bright orange flames. The terrifying realization hit him with the force of a freight train, and the true devastating climax of the evening finally arrived. I threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, resonant laugh of absolute pure amusement that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and completely shattered the heavy, suffocating tension in the living room. The sound of my laughter was so entirely unexpected, so completely devoid of any fear or intimidation, that it physically startled the security guards. The lead guard, who was gripping my arm, slowly loosened his hold, stepping back with a look of severe confusion. He looked at me, and then looked at the wealthy white executive standing by the fireplace, suddenly realizing that the power dynamic in the room was not what he had originally assumed. Bradley stood frozen, his hand hovering precariously over the open flames. His jaw went completely slack. The sheer terror in his pale blue eyes was absolutely magnificent to witness. He slowly pulled his hand back away from the fire, clutching the thick stack of certified documents tightly against his chest as if they were a physical shield. But the shield was completely useless. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out a sleek black tablet. I did not look at the security guards. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Bradley as my fingers danced rapidly across the smooth glass screen. With one final decisive tap, I activated the casting feature connected directly to the penthouse wireless network. Behind Bradley, the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the stone fireplace suddenly flared to life. The sudden burst of bright white light cast long, harsh shadows across the dining room, forcing everyone to shield their eyes for a fraction of a second. "What is that?" Trey asked, his voice trembling with a sudden, overwhelming sense of impending doom. I stepped out from the circle of security guards, walking slowly and confidently toward the center of the room. The guards did not try to stop me. They were completely mesmerized by the massive glowing screen and the undeniable authority radiating from my every single movement. "That tray," I announced, pointing directly at the television, "is the actual reason I am standing in this house today." The screen displayed a massive, highly complex financial web. It was a sprawling network of offshore accounts, dummy corporations, holding companies, and wire transfer routes. Every single entity was connected by bright red digital lines, creating a map of absolute, undeniable corporate fraud. It was a visual masterpiece of forensic accounting, and it outlined the exact structure of Bradley's entire criminal empire. But the map did not just show my stolen $50 million trust fund. It went so much deeper. I tapped my tablet screen again, and the television zoomed in dramatically on a specific cluster of red lines centered right around Trey's supposed tech startup. "You see, Bradley," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the dead silent room. When my team began tracking the anomalies in my trust fund, we noticed that the money was not just sitting in Trey's Delaware shell company. It was moving constantly. Massive sums of cash were being wired in from untraceable overseas accounts, mixing perfectly with my clean trust fund money, and then being wired right back out to the Eastern European private equity syndicate you mentioned earlier. Trey let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He looked up at the massive screen, seeing his own name listed as the primary managing director of a global money laundering hub. "Your fake tech company is not a startup, Trey," I continued, turning to look at my terrified brother. "It is a highly active, high-volume money laundering front for one of the most dangerous organized crime syndicates in the world. You are currently the legally registered chief executive officer of a massive international criminal enterprise." Trey stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed into one of the dining chairs. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. He finally realized that his flashy designer clothes and his diamond-encrusted Rolex were purchased with blood money, and he was the one holding the absolute full legal liability. But I was not done. The true jaw-dropping payoff was still waiting to be delivered. I tapped my screen a third time. The financial web disappeared, completely replaced by a high-resolution scanned image of a heavily redacted legal contract. It was the private equity loan agreement Bradley had used to borrow the $50 million from the Eastern European syndicate. Chloe let out a sharp cry, recognizing the name of her cosmetics empire listed as the primary corporate collateral. She had already accepted that she was going to lose her business. But she had no idea about the secondary guarantor clause. I highlighted a specific paragraph at the very bottom of the document, illuminating it in bright yellow on the massive screen. Bradley needed a secondary guarantor to secure a loan of that magnitude, I explained, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace. The syndicate demanded hard real estate assets just in case the cosmetics company suddenly lost its market value. So Bradley brought them the deed to a massive ultra-luxury property. He brought them this exact $12 million penthouse. Chloe shook her head violently. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That is impossible. The penthouse is in my mother's name. Bradley could not leverage the house without her explicit legal consent." I looked directly at my mother, Brenda. She was standing frozen, her face ashen, her eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. She was staring at the bottom of the television screen, where a very clear, very familiar signature rested on the dotted line of the guarantor agreement. It was Brenda's signature. "You signed it, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "You signed the paperwork because Bradley told you it was a standard family trust update. You trusted him so blindly, you worshipped his wealthy white corporate status so completely that you did not even bother to read the fine print. You legally pledged this very mansion to an Eastern European crime syndicate. And because Bradley defaulted on the loan, you are now personally liable for the remaining balance." Brenda let out a blood-curdling scream of absolute horror. She grabbed her heavy diamond necklace, tearing it right off her neck in a fit of violent panic. The diamonds scattered across the hardwood floor with a loud clattering sound, but nobody even looked down. She fell to her knees, weeping hysterically, realizing that her toxic favoritism had literally cost her the roof over her head. She was going to lose everything she had ever valued. The security guards exchanged nervous, terrified glances. They were trained to handle unruly guests and minor domestic disputes. They were absolutely not trained to stand in the middle of a massive federal money laundering bust involving international crime syndicates. The lead guard slowly holstered his weapon and took 2 large steps backward, completely removing his team from the conflict. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the radioactive fallout happening in the room. Bradley was completely broken. The stack of fake bank statements and the real federal documents slipped from his sweating fingers and scattered across the stone hearth. He sank down onto the raised edge of the fireplace, clutching his head in his hands. He looked like a defeated, pathetic animal. His supremacist arrogance, his corporate superiority, his entire fabricated reality had been entirely annihilated. I walked right up to him, stopping just inches away from where he sat. I looked down at him with absolute unfiltered disgust. The room was filled with the sound of my mother's hysterical sobbing and my brother's pathetic whimpering, but I focused entirely on the man who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. "I wore these rags today, so you would look down on me, Bradley," I said, my voice calm, steady, and carrying the lethal weight of absolute victory. "And your supremacist arrogance made you comfortable enough to confess to corporate fraud." I reached toward the doorway where Sarah, my elite security specialist, was standing quietly holding my sleeping son. She stepped forward, holding the baby securely. I reached my hand out and gently folded back the top edge of the faded cotton blanket wrapped tightly around Leo. Tucked discreetly into the thick seam of the fabric was a tiny black microscopic recording device. A tiny glowing red light pulsed slowly, indicating that it was actively transmitting. "You confessed right into the microscopic wire tapped inside my son's blanket," I stated clearly, pointing directly at the tiny device. Bradley stared at the blinking red light, his eyes widening in absolute horror. The encrypted phone call I had threatened earlier was never meant to be a warning. It was already a live open line. Every single word of his arrogant racist rant, every single admission of guilt, every threat he had made against me had been transmitted instantly to the lead federal prosecutor standing by in a command center just 3 miles away. The bait had been swallowed completely whole. The trap had slammed shut with bone-crushing force. And there was absolutely no escape. The silence in the room was so profound it felt like a physical vacuum. Bradley stared at the tiny blinking red light on my son's blanket as if it were the eye of a lethal sniper aimed directly at his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He had spent the last hour verbally digging his own grave, and he had just realized he threw himself into it. Before anyone could even attempt to process the magnitude of his recorded confession, the distant high-pitched wail of federal sirens pierced the quiet night air of the affluent Atlanta suburb. The sound started as a faint hum, but rapidly multiplied, echoing off the manicured streets and luxury facades. Within seconds, the wail became a deafening mechanical roar completely surrounding the $12 million penthouse estate. Bright, violent flashes of red and blue light suddenly strobed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The intense flashing colors washed over the expensive Italian leather sofas, the crystal chandeliers, and the horrified faces of my family. It was the undeniable, terrifying glow of instant karma. The 3 private security guards who had been aggressively crowding me just minutes ago practically leaped backward. The lead guard rushed to the window, peering down at the private courtyard. His face drained of color. He saw a massive fleet of black tactical vehicles smashing through the gated community entrance, completely bypassing the neighborhood's security protocols. Heavily armed agents were swarming the perimeter. The guard instantly dropped his hands away from his weapon, backing away from me until his shoulders hit the wall. He and his men wanted absolutely nothing to do with the federal government. They stood down, completely neutralized by the sheer, terrifying scale of the raid. I turned my back on the guards and walked directly toward Chloe and Bradley. If a camera were capturing this precise moment, it would have zoomed into an extreme close-up on my face. The red and blue lights flashing rapidly across my features, highlighting the cold, absolute power in my eyes. Chloe was trembling violently, holding her hands over her ears, as if she could somehow block out the sound of the sirens and the reality of her impending destruction. Bradley was still sitting on the stone hearth, paralyzed, staring at me like a man waiting for the executioner to drop the heavy blade. "You told your wife that the Eastern European syndicate was coming to seize her company on Monday morning," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the noise of the approaching sirens. You told my mother they were going to take this house because you defaulted on your massive illicit loan. You used their violent reputation to terrify your own family into submission. I paused, letting the strobe lights illuminate the sheer panic on their faces. But you severely underestimated the scope of my investigation, Bradley. I continued, taking one final step closer to the defeated couple. When my team uncovered your connection to that organized crime syndicate, we did not just sit back and watch. We froze their offshore accounts. We seized their domestic assets, and we forced them into a corner so tight they were desperate to liquidate any outstanding debts they held on paper just to pay for their federal defense attorneys. Chloe slowly lowered her hands from her ears, her tear-streaked face looking up at me in utter confusion. What does that mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the blaring sirens outside. It means, Chloe, I said, my tone devoid of any sisterly affection, that the syndicate was absolutely desperate for clean cash. They needed to quickly offload the $50 million loan your husband took out against your company and your mother's house. So they quietly auctioned off that specific corporate debt. And because I had been tracking the entire operation, I knew exactly when and where that highly secretive auction was taking place. Bradley let out a choked gasp, his eyes widening to impossible proportions. He finally understood what I was about to say, but his arrogant brain completely refused to accept it. No, he stammered, shaking his head frantically. No, you could not have. You do not have that kind of capital, Maya. You are just a federal employee. You do not have the liquid assets to buy out a syndicate. I let a sharp, terrifying smile cross my face. I do not have the capital, Bradley. But KPMG International does. I pitched the massive acquisition to the senior partners at my firm. I showed them the pristine profit margins of Chloe's cosmetics empire and the prime real estate value of this penthouse. I proved to them that acquiring this defaulted debt was an incredibly lucrative corporate investment, and they agreed entirely. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single crisp document. It was not a bank statement. It was a fully executed transfer of deed and corporate ownership. I dropped it onto the mahogany table right in front of Chloe. My firm bought your entire defaulted loan for pennies on the dollar, I announced, delivering the absolute final financial knockout. We purchased the debt legally, completely bypassing the criminal syndicate, which means the dangerous men you were terrified of are no longer coming for your assets. They have absolutely no claim to your company or this house. Chloe let out a massive, breathless sigh of relief, her shoulders dropping as she foolishly believed I had just saved her. Oh my God, Maya, she cried out, reaching her hand toward me. You saved the company. You saved us. I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. My face remained a mask of cold, hard ice. I did not save you, Chloe, I corrected her, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. I bought you. The relief on her face vanished instantly, replaced by a new profound level of absolute horror. I did not come here to collect a measly $250,000 a month. I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I came to repossess the entire empire. As of this exact second, this house, that company, I own it all. The reality of my words crashed down on the room like a collapsing building. I was no longer the outcast sister begging for a seat at the table. I was the primary stakeholder. I was the landlord. I was the absolute owner of every single thing they valued in this world. Bradley buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing groan. His entire life's work, his master plan to steal a fortune and control a wealthy black family, had resulted in him handing the entire empire directly over to the very woman he had relentlessly mocked and underestimated. His white savior complex was entirely shattered, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a guaranteed prison sentence. My mother, Brenda, let out another hysterical wail, realizing that the daughter she had just verbally disowned and tried to throw out on the street was now the sole legal owner of the $12 million roof over her head. She was entirely at my absolute mercy. And Trey, the arrogant tech founder, was simply crying silently, realizing he was going from a luxury penthouse directly to a federal holding cell. Just as the sheer magnitude of their complete defeat settled over them, the heavy custom mahogany front doors were violently breached. A team of 20 heavily armed federal agents poured into the grand foyer. They wore thick tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the expensive marble floors, completely shattering the delicate high society illusion of the penthouse. The lead federal agent, a tall, stern woman with an uncompromising expression, marched directly into the dining room. She bypassed the private security guards, who immediately raised their hands high in total surrender, keeping their backs flat against the wall. She looked at the flashing red light on my son's blanket, gave me a brief professional nod of acknowledgement, and then turned her attention directly to the wealthy elite standing before her. "Bradley Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and racketeering," the agent announced, her loud, authoritative voice cutting through the wailing sirens outside. Two large agents immediately grabbed Bradley by his expensive tailored suit, roughly pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly in the room. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. A second group of agents moved directly toward the dining table, grabbing my brother Trey. He did not even try to fight them. He just kept sobbing as they secured his wrists behind his back, reciting his Miranda rights. The flashy diamond-encrusted Rolex watch on his wrist clinked harshly against the cold federal steel of the handcuffs. Chloe and Brenda stood huddled together in the corner of the room, weeping uncontrollably as they watched the two men they had worshipped being dragged out of the penthouse like common street criminals. The glittering wealthy empire they had sacrificed their own souls to protect had been entirely dismantled in less than an hour. They had lost absolutely everything. And as the red and blue lights continued to flash across the silent dining room, they finally realized that the only person to blame was standing right in front of them, completely victorious. The federal agents did not waste any time. They gripped Bradley by his tailored suit jacket and marched him roughly toward the grand foyer. His expensive leather shoes dragged against the marble floor, leaving scuff marks that mirrored the sudden destruction of his pristine corporate image. As they shoved him through the heavy mahogany doors, he twisted his head back to look at me one last time. There was no defiance left in his pale blue eyes, only the hollow, vacant stare of a man who knew he would be spending the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Trey followed right behind him, weeping loudly and uncontrollably. My brother, the supposed tech genius, and the pride of our family bloodline, was hyperventilating so hard an agent had to physically hold him upright just to get him out the door. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched them being paraded out into the manicured courtyard. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the faces of the wealthy neighbors who had stepped out onto their balconies to witness the spectacle. Bradley Vance, the arrogant white savior who thought he owned this black family, was publicly humiliated, stripped of his dignity, and thrown into the back of an armored federal vehicle like a common thug. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, leaving a profound, heavy silence in their wake. The private security guards quietly slipped out the back service elevator, desperate to escape the fallout. The only people left in the ruined living room were me, my sleeping son Sarah, my security specialist, and the two shattered women who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. My mother Brenda slowly turned toward me. The woman who had proudly thrown a glass of red wine at my face just an hour ago was now entirely broken. Her legs gave out and she dropped heavily to her knees on the plush white rug. She crawled toward me, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs, her hands reaching out desperately for the hem of my charcoal suit. "Maya, please," she wailed, her voice ragged and raw. Please do not do this. Do not take the house. It is everything I have. I am your mother. You cannot put your own mother out on the street." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing. I took a deliberate physical step backward, ensuring her hands only grasped empty air. "You stopped being my mother the day you decided my gender made me inferior to my brother," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You stood by and cheered while that man stole my future. You offered to sacrifice my son to protect a criminal. You made your choice, Brenda. Now you get to live with the consequences of it. I am giving you exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property. After that, you are legally trespassing, and I will have you forcibly removed." She collapsed entirely, sobbing into the rug, begging for a second chance that I was absolutely never going to give her. I established a wall of pure steel, cutting off all contact with her toxic presence forever. I simply stepped right past her. I walked over to the mahogany dining table where Chloe was leaning heavily against the wood. She looked absolutely pathetic. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined, her hair was a mess, and the emerald green dress she wore like armor now just looked like a cheap costume. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, frantic pleading. "Maya, please." Chloe begged, her voice cracking with sheer exhaustion. "What am I supposed to do? My husband is going to prison. My company is in ruins. I do not have a single dollar to my name. You own everything. I am begging you for a lifeline. I am your sister." I stared at her, evaluating the wreckage of the woman she had chosen to become. She had traded her independence, her morals, and her own family just to play the role of a wealthy socialite controlled entirely by an arrogant manipulator. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out 2 crisp pieces of paper. I placed them flat on the dining table right in front of her. The first was a thick cardstock business card. "This is the contact information for one of the best trauma therapists in the state," I told her, keeping my tone strictly professional. "You are going to need it to unpack the severe psychological damage you allowed that man to inflict on you." I tapped the second piece of paper. It was a standard corporate employment agreement printed on KPMG International letterhead. "I am not giving you a handout, Chloe," I continued. "I am not going to let you pretend to be a chief executive officer of a company you no longer own. This is an entry-level employment contract in the logistics department of the cosmetics brand. You will be making minimum wage. You will be reporting to a regional manager. You will have no executive privileges, no corner office, and absolutely no corporate expense account." Chloe stared at the entry-level contract, her jaw trembling as the reality of her new life set in. "You want me to start from the bottom?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I want you to start from reality," I corrected her firmly. "Start from the bottom. If you still have an ounce of self-respect as a Black woman, learn to stand without a toxic man pulling your strings. Rebuild your life with your own 2 hands, or walk out that door and figure it out on your own. The choice is entirely yours." I did not wait for her answer. I did not need to. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family, walked over to Sarah, and gently took my sleeping son back into my arms. I walked out of the penthouse, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open behind me. I stepped into the cool night air, leaving the toxic trauma, the gaslighting, and the generational abuse completely behind me. I was finally entirely free. The chaotic scene of the penthouse slowly dissolves, fading seamlessly back into the quiet, luxurious warmth of my present-day living room. I am sitting comfortably in my suede armchair, the soft, moody lighting casting a calm, peaceful glow across the space. I am no longer wearing the charcoal gray suit. I am dressed in comfortable, elegant loungewear, looking directly into the camera lens with a profound sense of absolute peace. I reach over to the small marble side table next to me and pick up a delicate ceramic cup. I take a slow, deliberate sip of warm herbal tea, letting the quiet comfort of my self-made sanctuary wash over me. I look back at the camera, my eyes reflecting the quiet strength of a woman who fought a massive war and won everything. Building a life after surviving a toxic family is not about proving them wrong. I say, my voice calm, steady, and deeply resonant. It is not about screaming your truth until your throat bleeds. It is about quietly removing their access to your energy, your peace, and your potential. People ask me if I feel guilty for tearing down their empire. But you cannot tear down something that was built entirely on lies. It was always destined to collapse. I just happened to be the one holding the structural blueprints. I set my teacup back down on the marble table, folding my hands gently in my lap. A soft, confident smile touches the corners of my mouth. The sweetest revenge is not seeing them bleed, I say, delivering the final truth with absolute chilling perfection. It is the moment they realize the person they treated like dirt holds the absolute deed to their existence. The screen slowly fades to pitch black, leaving only the resonance of those final words lingering in the air. The credits begin to roll,